The Don't Say Gay bill passed recently by the Florida legislature has been front page news, and it has caused a social media torrent of posts both for and against. This Republican backed legislation banning LGBTQ instruction in primary schools is sitting on Florida Governor's Ron DeSantis' desk awaiting his signature. DeSantis has signaled that his signature is forthcoming. The bill has LGBT advocates and allies worried that once in effect, it will usher in a new era of unlawful discrimination and retribution against gay and lesbians and their family members. Today we're asking, what will this bill mean for the state of Florida, for elementary school education, and the safety of millions of LGBT residents in the state of Florida? All coming up next.
Los Angeles. This is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
The Don't Say Gay bill passed the Republican-controlled Senate by 22-17. It also passed the Republican-controlled State House in Florida 2 weeks later by a vote of 69-47. Now, this proposed ban prevents public school districts from teaching about sexual orientation or gender identity for grades kindergarten through third. And it also bans them from talking about gender identity and sexual orientation in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students. Now, according to critics of this law, this language, this vague language, could extend the ban to higher grade levels. Opponents of the bill also argue that the bill is discriminatory and an attempt by Republican lawmakers to garner political support amid a broader climate of increasing disdain for LGBT rights and heightened scrutiny over what children are taught in public schools. Here for our leadoff discussion to help us make sense of this bill and its impact is Cathryn Oakley. She is the state legislative director in Florida. She's also senior counsel at the National LGBT Advocacy Group Human Rights Campaign. Good morning and welcome, Cathryn.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
So, Cathryn, I really got interested in this law because a couple of reasons. One, the headlines that have just been dominating the airways over the last week or so, and the back and forth between the governor and some of the corporations in the state of Florida. But also, I got a text message from a really good friend of mine asking to help her make sense of the bill, saying, "Look, I don't want to be on the wrong side of this, but what is so bad about not teaching kindergartners about gay rights?" And after I found myself writing her this, what appeared to be like a book on text, responding to her, telling her everything that was bad about it, I said, you know what? I think I need to do a show on this. I need to invite some experts from Florida so that my friend who is on the right side of all issues will have a better understanding of what's going on in Florida. So help us understand just at the basic level what this law does.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, because there is confusion about it. And, the first thing that I'll say about this bill is that it, like the other more than 300 anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation moving through state legislatures in the country this year, is 100% motivated by discrimination. What we are not seeing is that this is the response to an actual problem. What we're not seeing is that there's some kind of authentic, on-the-ground grassroots concern that's bubbling up. This, like these other bills, including about 130 bills which are specifically targeting transgendered children, this is in state legislatures across the country, it's motivated by discrimination. So starting off there, as you say, this is not a bill that's about teaching gay rights to anyone. And if you listen to the proponents of this bill, they have lots of things to say in support of this, some of which are in incredibly poor taste. One of the sort of allegations is this idea that if young folks in school are exposed to just the very concepts of gender identity and sexual orientation, that this is in some way going to turn them LGBTQ. What we do know is that for kids who are in the closet, kids who are afraid, that having terminology that helps explain what it is that they're feeling can be helpful. What we do know is that for kids who have same-sex parents, being able to talk in the classroom about what they did over their weekend is really good for their mental health. And what we do know is that when teachers are allowed to be their true selves in the classroom, that they're able to teach with an authenticity and a vibrance that is not there when they're forced to hide who they are. Those are things that are true. What is not true is the idea that anyone is teaching children how to be LGBTQ. What is not true is that teaching small children about these issues is in any way going to change their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And to the point that you made, the additional sort of for grades older than grade 3, the requirement is that conversation must be, quote, age appropriate. I don't think anybody has an issue with something that's truly age appropriate, right? But because that's not defined in the bill, and because attempts to define it have been rebuffed in a way that show really what the anti-LGBTQ animus is, it's clear that this bill is meant to discriminate. That is the intention of the bill. And so teachers are going to be completely chilled from being able to have any conversations whatsoever, knowing that if they do so, they could be in really big trouble.
Let me start. You said a lot, and thank you for that explanation of the bill. Let's go back to this notion, and I think this is the fear that a lot of people that think that they are supportive or call themselves supportive of the LGBTQ community, that they say, well, as an adults should be able to make whatever decisions they want to make about their gender identity or about their sexual preferences. But when it comes to little kids, there is this fear and this myth that somehow by having a gay person around a little kid or by talking about gender identity around children, that you are somehow turning this child out or encouraging this child, or somehow by proximity to a gay person, this child will then become gay. Help debunk that myth, because I think that's a lot of fear that adults who consider themselves well-meaning still have.
Well, I'll just give my personal example, which is that when I was in school, it was not the era where we read about gay penguins raising babies together, and I still turned out queer. It's not the kind of thing where there's that sort of cause and effect. The only thing that truly might happen is that you have a kid who is already LGBTQ and is struggling to find the words to fit that identity. And they hear those words and suddenly they understand, hey, that is the thing that I've been trying to say. It's not that they were straight or cisgender before and then they were exposed to this idea and something changed them. It's about exposure to an idea, giving them the vocabulary, giving them the concept to be able to articulate who they are. I do think that there's some concern because there are so many young people who are feeling more comfortable about coming out at an early age, that there's some concern that there's something happening, something in the water, something in the air. And as you said, there's already a very strong effort to surveil what's happening in schools and to censor what teachers are able to say and do. And I think the collision of that movement and this movement to try to target LGBTQ people, but particularly transgender youth, those things have collided. And that's what we see in the Don't Say Gay or Trans bill.
Yeah, the thing that I said to my friend back in the text, one of the many things that I said to her is think about what we say about relationships, heterosexual relationships, because she says, well, why are we talking about this at all? And I says, well, because we do talk about it. We talk about mommy and daddy in heterosexual relationships. The family structure is very much a part of kindergarten. Draw your family, right? I mean, that's probably assignment on day one is show us a picture of your family, get up in front of the classroom and say, that's mommy, that's dad. So that is a conversation about a heterosexual relationship, whether you call it, let's talk about heterosexual people or not. So I said, well, what if a kid has two mommies? What are they to do? Are they not to show their family and the family that they come from and feel proud about that? So I think there's some simple things that happen that we accept as heterosexuals that when we talk about it outside of our heterosexual relationships, people think, well, that's bad. And I was like, no, if I can talk about my husband, why can't someone talk about their wife if they happen to be married to a woman married to a woman? So how do we break down those stereotypes, those biases? Because I don't think my friend or anyone like my friend is trying to discriminate against gay people, but I think they do compartmentalize these conversations.
Well, and the point that you're making is really important, right? There's something about same-sex relationships where people sort of feel like that's an inherently sexual conversation, right? That if you're having a conversation about two people who are of the same gender who are in a relationship, that's somehow an inherently sexual conversation. And to your point, that is just simply not true, right? You are going to have kids in these classrooms who have parents who are of the same gender. When they share that, that is not sexual content. That is not inherently sexualized content. And when you're talking, for example, about a trans person, right? I mean, that is even separate from this idea of sexual orientation. This is the idea of this is truly, fundamentally who somebody believes that they are and who they in fact are. And their inability to be able to express that to their teacher, who is perhaps a person who they would otherwise really feel safe being with, that's a major concern.
Yeah, one of the things I was reading, as you talked about how they tried to define some of these terms and some of the ugly animus came out, it was a comment during, I guess, one of the Senate hearings where a state senator gave an example of a math problem. So the teacher is saying, Sally has two moms and Johnny has two dads, and to set up a math problem of addition, subtraction. And he says, this is exactly what that bill aims to prevent. From a teacher standing up in a classroom using as an example two mommies or two daddies. And I was, again, just struck by how obvious that bias is. Like, what would be wrong with that? Because I assume in Florida, in K through 3, there's no curriculum called, today we're going to talk about, gender identity, or pull out your sexual identification notebooks. I assume those classes don't exist.
Right. Well, and you're absolutely right. There was an amendment that was offered that said, look, if this is supposed to be about sex ed, what you are trying to prevent is a sex ed class that's going to include LGBTQ folks in K to 3, then here's an amendment that makes the bill say that. And the sponsor said, no, that would really defeat the point of my bill. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. Those are expressions of animus, right? And that is what connects this Don't Say Gay or Trans bill to these other bills that we're seeing across the country, which are motivated by animus. It is about trying to peel back the rights of LGBTQ youth, particularly trans youth, all across the country. And it is not about an actual problem, right? It's not because there's health class that's being taught in a way that people object to for a kindergartner. It's not that. It is truly the very existence of LGBTQ people being the problem, being something that they feel is shameful and needs to be hidden away.
Yeah, I can't help but compare this to what we're seeing around critical race theory, right? All of these efforts to prevent, all of these bills to prevent the teaching of critical race theory in public schools, because it's not being taught in public schools in the first instance, but let's create a problem and then say we have the solution to it. Mm-hmm. Are they just, using the critical race theory playbook, these state legislators in Florida, again, to create this illusion that sexual orientation is being taught to these young kids and say, now we have the solution to it?
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. And when I say that there's this movement around curriculum censorship that's colliding with this movement of attacking LGBT and particularly transgender youth, that's exactly what I mean. This idea that schools are indoctrinating young people, it is completely a fabricated conversation in order to create a quote unquote solution that serves their purposes, which is discrimination.
Yeah, let's talk about the response. We're going to talk, I have some advocates on later. We're going to talk about the advocates' response, but I want to focus with you on this Disney, because that controversy between the president of Disney and some of the advocacy groups in Florida have gotten lots of attention. Disney was called upon by the advocates in the state to take a stance, and the president was pretty slow, dragging his feet, basically saying, we're going to stay out of this. We support LGBT communities. What do you make of that and how Disney has handled their response to the bill?
Well, one of the things that the CEO said in his first statement was that corporations can't have an impact on what's happening in state legislatures. And I just could not disagree more strongly. We have seen over the course of the last several years where we've been battling back a lot of discriminatory legislation in state legislatures. We've seen the incredible power that corporations can have. They have incredible power because they're, of course, job creators, and the legislators want to make sure that they're happy, that they're going to stay where they are. But they also have incredible power because often the legislators that they're working with are people who are maybe a little bit more conservative than the folks that are the best sort of outward friends of the LGBTQ advocates. And so it helps us get in the door with folks who otherwise are maybe a little bit less interested in talking to us. And it gives us the opportunity to be able to explain the business case, right? And to be able to explain why it's important for a corporation to be standing up for its employees, why it's important for a corporation to be able to stand up for its customers.
Yeah.
And so I do think that was a very mistaken impression that I think over the course of the week, Disney came to understand was incorrect and something that they actually could change.
Yeah, one of the things that we should know too is all the reasons you said it's important to have corporations weigh in on these matters, but also these corporations give hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to the state legislators. And we know in the case of Disney's, they've given hundreds of thousands of dollars to some of the Republican lawmakers who backed this bill. Now, they've done that at the same time that we've seen Disney over the last several years feature gay characters in its films, sell LGBT pride-themed merchandise. Their theme parks have a LGBT, loyal fan base. I guess they have 150,000 visitors that actually come to Orlando's Walt Disney World during, I guess, what they call annual gay days. So Disney's has been kind of schizophrenic in some ways. I read somewhere where they threw some couples, same-sex couples who were dancing in the park out of the park. But yet they have this LGBT focus with respect to some of its merchandise and its characters. So, I mean, as advocate yourself, where does Disney fit on this kind of continuum of corporations that either support or, doesn't support LGBT rights?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that Disney has said that they're going to do is they're suspending donations to Florida legislators while they assess what their ongoing giving strategy is going to be. And, that makes a lot of sense given what all has transpired. And, I think also in terms of the content, that was something else that the CEO said was, our corporate values speak for themselves in terms of the products that we put out. And, there's real truth in that. And also they have employees, they have customers who are truly afraid. And I think that is something that maybe wasn't connecting for them in the beginning, which is this is actually directly going to impact your employees, the kids of folks who work at Disney, the families of folks who work at Disney, and folks in their communities, and not to mention your customers, right? And so I do think that there was a little bit of an evolution over the course of the week, and I think a lot also still remains to be seen. But they did say that for now they're going to be they're pausing those donations while they evaluate and see if there's anything else that they can be doing in this space.
And it's interesting to note that Governor DeSantis came out and slammed Disney's president, called him the woke president or the woke corporation, some kind of, comment meant to berate him. But what do you make of this $5 million? So the president of Disney said he's going to donate $5 million to LGBT organizations, including the human rights organization. And the organizations rejected it, said, no, we don't want your money. Why did they reject the money?
Well, it's not because we don't like money, of course, but look, this is a serious situation. This is a serious situation. This is a bill that is truly going to hurt people. And Disney sat out. And so now, there's an opportunity for them to really do some important and substantial things to make a difference. And while, of course, making donations is a great way to empower the folks who are doing this work to be able to do more and better work, it also can't be a free ticket to say, I'm going to behave in a certain way, and then I'll just make a donation and I'll get off scot-free. And so that's why the Human Rights Campaign said, no, we're not accepting your money. That's not what's happening right now. What we need to see from you is really substantial change first before we're going to be in a position where we're going to say, sure, well, we'll take the money.
So what are the kinds of things you'd like to see a company like Disney do?
You know, we have some corporate allies who show up in such a tremendous way. And that's one of the reasons why I think, this comment that, corporations can't help is just so incredibly wrong. Corporations, as I said, have contacts that the LGBTQ advocates don't have, right? So they can be calling those people and they can be making the business case, which is a very real case to say, look, our employees are not going to want to come to the state anymore. Our employees are asking not to have to be transferred here because they're afraid of what their lives are going to be like. From our standpoint, if we're thinking about hosting a big conference or having an expansion of our work, this is going to be something that's going to encourage us to do that someplace else, because we just can't justify bringing more folks into this state if we can't guarantee their safety. And so that's the kind of thing where, those things can happen behind the scenes. They can also happen publicly, and that's something that is really great. We actually just had more than 60 corporations sign on to a full page ad that we took out in the Dallas Morning News to say that they want for Governor Abbott to change tack on his recent attacks on transgender youth and the families of transgender youth. That's something.
Abbott in Texas, right?
Yeah, that's in Texas, right? And so we had 60 companies come out on that ad to call on the governor to do something different. There are lots of opportunities like that for corporations to speak out and to throw their weight around in favor of true, meaningful progress. And that's what we would like to do. Donations are great, but it's not a substitute for doing the actual work.
So I know Disney is a large employer in the state of Florida, but it's not in the top 10 largest employers. Why were they singled out? Or are there others, big companies like Disney, that you're also trying to get involved in terms of, using their power in the state to impact what happens?
Well, to be clear, we didn't single anybody out. The CEO made his own comments, and those became public, and so that was the beginning of that conversation. We do lots of work with companies behind the scenes, and I know that Equality Florida does as well. Lots of work with companies behind the scenes, making sure that they're abreast of what's happening and asking them to weigh in when they can.
Okay, so you're saying it was the president's own comments and the employees at Disney, because there's this trending hashtag Disney Do Better, and we have heard employees threatening to walk out and employees demanding that their president do better.
Well, and I do think that was a super, super important factor. I don't mean to minimize that at all. That was incredibly important. People speaking out and saying, hey, this is my life. You're supposed to be caring about me. I'm on your team. And how is it possible that you're not, you don't have my back on this? This is big. This is scary. I'd love for you to be throwing your heft around. I do a lot for you. And this is something I'm asking you to do for me. And absolutely, that was incredibly important, because that's the reason he was making comments in the first place that then ended up becoming public.
Right. And what about other companies? Are there other companies in Florida who have either gotten involved one way or the other? Are there other trending hashtags related to those companies?
Yeah, I mean, there are other companies that have definitely gotten involved, and some of them have done that behind the scenes, but they have made phone calls. They have helped make sure that legislators understand what's at stake, make sure that the governor understands what's at stake. The governor is not actually all that concerned about what's at stake, and some of the most really vile comments about what this bill is about have come out of his office, including one comment that said that this bill, anybody who didn't support this bill was in favor of grooming of young children, which is just really outrageously awful, but does really show the animus and the discrimination that is behind this, right? Again, it's not about a real problem. It is about animus. It is about discrimination. And so, yeah, there have been lots of corporations that have come out and said their piece, but some of them have opted to do that more quietly, and really Disney came into the limelight for having not done that in the way that they really should have.
And like, what's next? So all this pressure, obviously, the bill has been passed both in the Senate and in the House. It's now on DeSantis's desk, waiting for his signature. He's signaled that he's going to sign it. Is there any hope that this pressure, this public pressure, will, sway him against signing it? Any hopes of that, or do you think it's just going to get signed and go into effect?
I think given the comments that he's made in the last few days, I don't think there's any reason to think that he's changed his mind. But I'll also tell you that as an advocate for LGBTQ equality, and I suspect this goes for your other guests today as well, it's really important never to give up. And whether this is the place that we're able to have a conversation about whether this is the place where we have a pivot point or not, this is worth fighting for. It's worth fighting even if we lose. It's worth fighting. And so we're going to keep fighting, and we're going to see where we get when it comes time to sign the bill. And if the governor signs the bill, that's not the end of the fight. We're going to keep fighting after that, because it's our job to stop bad legislation from passing, but that's because ultimately it's our job to protect the LGBTQ community, and that includes the kids and adults who are going to be impacted by this bill after it's passed, if that's what happens. So the fight goes on.
Well, thank you so much, Cathryn, for your advocacy, and thank you for shedding some light on what's actually happening with this bill. And as you said, the fight will continue. We'll continue to watch what happens with the bill. If it does actually get signed by the governor, I assume even when it is signed, there's going to be a flurry of lawsuits to challenge the bill. So signing, as you said, won't be the end of this fight. The fight will definitely continue. And as long as advocates like you are on the ground, I'm certain that there's going to be some victory, maybe not immediately, but definitely in the long term. So again, thank you for the work that you do and for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, my next guest are Brandon Wolf. He is the press secretary for Equality Florida, which is the state's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization. And Brandon is also a survivor of the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting. And joining him is Sharita Gruberg. She is the vice president of the LGBTQ research and communications project at American Progress. Good morning, Sharita, and good morning, Brandon.
Good morning.
Morning.
Brandon, I want to start with you. You survived the vicious attack that happened at the Pulse nightclub in Florida in 2016, where 49 people, mostly members of the LGBTQ community, were killed. So when you think about this bill, what's your initial reaction to it?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. And I think that gets to why I find the bill so deeply repulsive and offensive. People know a bit about my story and the stories of my best friends. On a very normal night, we went to one of the safest places on earth for us. We went to Pulse nightclub, a place we had been hundreds of times before. They know that a man charged in the front door. He was armed with an assault weapon and a handgun. They know that he fired over 110 rounds into a crowded nightclub. They know that 49 people, mostly LGBTQ people of color, were murdered. They never got to go home and say goodbye to their parents. They may also know that my best friends, Drew and Juan, were standing on the dance floor when they took 19 rounds between the two of them, that one died on an operating table and the other never made it off the club floor. But more important than how they died is how they lived. My best friends were loving, they were caring, they were family people. They liked music and concerts and liked having friends over for wine and movies. And they were also proudly LGBTQ members of society. They have family members. They have nieces and nephews and siblings that may be in school right now in Central Florida. And the idea that someone would suggest that the lives and legacies of Drew and Juan and 47 other people would be deemed not age appropriate for conversation in classroom, that we would erase their lives and legacies from classrooms in Central Florida is deeply offensive. And it's to what Cathryn said, at the core of the animus that's at the center of this bill. This bill is rooted in anti-LGBTQ bigotry. It's the reason that the governor's office said if you oppose the bill, you're a pedophile. It's the reason that the bill sponsor in the Senate said that he was drawn to this bill because he's concerned about how many young people feel comfortable coming out as LGBTQ at a young age. There is a distinctly anti-LGBTQ animus at the center of the bill, and it's deeply offensive when you consider the kind of stories and people that it would erase.
Yeah, Brandon, thank you for sharing your friends, the stories of their lives, and even the tragic death. And I can't even imagine what the LGBT community across the country, but definitely there in Florida, is feeling. Because for me, this bill is just another way that we target LGBT members of our community and other them. And when we do that, then we make them the targets of vicious attacks, whether it's at a nightclub or just on the streets, the normal activities that people engage in. So it's very worrisome. And then on the legal front, Sharita, this bill does give litigation rights. It gives parents the rights to sue teachers if the kid comes home and says, teacher Betty talked about, little Billy's mom and mom. And if the parents feel like the teachers have engaged in some inappropriate comments or instruction about gender identity, they can file a lawsuit. How worrisome is that?
It's incredibly concerning. I mean, this is the state attempting to erase, stigmatize, and silence LGBTQI plus people and the entire community through a form of censorship. And so what this is going to do, and clearly the intent of this type of legislation, is a chilling effect. And so, as Kate mentioned earlier, this is a so-called solution in search of a problem. There is no issue of overly sexualizing young students. What this is trying to do is silence any recognition or acknowledgement of the existence of LGBTQI plus people. And through provisions like the one you mentioned, why would a teacher even risk it? Why would a teacher say, even acknowledge if they're in a same-sex relationship that they have a spouse of the same sex? It's that far-reaching and that concerning, where teachers, students, classrooms aren't even going to be able to acknowledge the existence of LGBTQI plus people. And the result is furthering the stigma, furthering the exclusion, furthering the violence and discrimination that the community is already facing, and moving the state and the community backwards, and trying to undo all the progress that we've seen in creating a more affirming and inclusive society.
Yeah, Brandon, one of the comments, in addition to that grooming comment coming from one of DeSantis's spokesperson, he himself said a comment, how many parents want transgenderism injected into the classroom? Again, from your perspective, is this just about this fear, this illogical fear? Because, there are so many myths, and I was having, Kate address some of them that people have, that somehow if heterosexual kids are in close proximity to kids who are either transgender or who identify as LGBTQ, that somehow will rub off on them or will have some impact on how they identify. It's kind of hard for me to believe in 2022 that that's still a pervasive myth, but is that a common myth that's still, that you have to confront as an LGBTQ advocate?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, listen, the idea or the insinuation that LGBTQ people simply by existing are a threat or a danger to children is the oldest anti-LGBTQ trope in the book. None of that is new. If you remember the 1970s, Anita Bryant in the state of Florida was building a national platform for herself politically on the Save Our Children campaign, which was, in essence, her saying we needed to save children from homosexuals who had invaded every ounce of their lives. And also keep in mind that, it was only in 2004, I was in high school, when my home state of Oregon passed a ban on same-sex marriage at a constitutional level. So we're not that far removed from a lot of the anti-LGBTQ policies that plagued this country in 2004, in 2010, even beyond into 2013, 2014. And a lot of the progress we've won has been through the courts, not legislatively. So the people who have a deep-seated fear of LGBTQ people have not gone away. They still exist in society. And what politicians have done right now is they've found a way to weaponize that fear and to put a new 2022 coat of paint on it by calling it parental rights or some other, Trojan horse to get it in the door. But what they're really talking about is the sort of bigotry and fear that's at the core of the bill, this fear that LGBTQ people by existing are going to have a negative impact on your children, this fear that LGBTQ people are pushing an agenda. I just want to sort of underscore what Kate said to dispel that fear. I grew up around a lot of heterosexual and cisgender people. My parents are heterosexual and cisgender. Most of my friends were heterosexual and cisgender. My teachers, my administrators, my church leaders, my counselors, and guess what? I'm still very, very gay. The idea that simply being in proximity to someone is going to change their sexual orientation or gender identity is absurd. It's built from that deep-seated fear that's been weaponized time and time again by politicians. And it's really shameful that people like Governor Ron DeSantis, who are doing it simply because they want to run for higher office, he does not care about the well-being of LGBTQ young people. He wants to be president in 2024. It's shameful that instead of solving actual problems like the property insurance crisis in Florida or the skyrocketing housing prices, that they are instead building this buffet of culture war issues to help curry favor with a right-wing base that can't stomach the kind of progress we've been able to secure over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years to propel them to that higher office.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up, because we're trying to understand what the motivation is, like why this law and why now. So Brandon, you offer, DeSantis has, high hopes to go on to bigger office, and he wants to use these culture wars as a way to galvanize, the base of the Republican Party. But Sharita, is this also being driven by money? Because I can imagine that these state legislators are out campaigning, fundraising on this bill and similar bills.
Well, the Equality Federation has been tracking these anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in the states. The current tally is over 240. And these are not organic.
Is this just in the state of Florida or across
in the country? Okay. And these are not an organic phenomenon. These are bills that were created by anti-LGBTQ organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has classified as a hate group, and are shopped around. That's why we're seeing so many repeated bills and similar bills. And there isn't a real issue that these are seeking to address. What they are doing is trying to give legislators like Governor DeSantis, who have failed at every turn in addressing the pandemic, in addressing the economic needs of Florida families, in addressing any actual issues, and give them something to distract voters with. And as Brandon said, this is a playbook that's been employed for decades. Thankfully, it's a playbook that repeatedly loses. Back in just 5-6 years ago, we saw states across the country, including my home state of North Carolina, introducing bathroom bills. Again, legislators who didn't really have legislation to move or a track record on improving the economic prospects of families in North Carolina or jobs or anything that North Carolina voters actually needed, thought that attacking vulnerable trans people in the state was going to be the way that they won. And what we saw was the anti-LGBTQ Governor McCrory got voted out. And so I fully expect that this ploy from certain legislators is going to once again fail, because the fact of the matter is society has moved forward, and the vast majority of Americans across political ideologies, across religious viewpoints, in every single congressional district in the country support LGBTQI plus equality. And while politicians like Governor DeSantis are speaking directly to a small and shrinking extremist population, the fact of the matter is the country is moving in another direction and they're going to have to catch up.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, Brandon, we were looking for polls this morning to see where the country was, and we found one poll that said over 60% of Americans oppose Don't Say Gay bill. So do you know what that number is in Florida? Is it around 60% of Floridians, or is it higher or lower?
Yeah, I think a poll that we saw a couple of weeks ago showed it near 50%, whereas, somewhere around 39 or 40% supported the legislation, which goes to tell you, in a state that's virtually 50-50 in terms of political ideology, bills like this remain extremely unpopular. It's also worth saying that before we secured non-discrimination protections through a Supreme Court ruling and then in Florida's Commission on Human Relations, we were helping to introduce a bill in the Florida legislature that would have given non-discrimination protections to Florida's LGBTQ community. It was the second most, and at times the most, co-sponsored bill in the Florida legislature. It had broad bipartisan support, and 70% of Floridians, when polled, said they believe that LGBTQ people deserve protection from discrimination in the state of Florida. The people of Florida are not in the same place as the governor and these far right-wing politicians in terms of the Don't Say Gay bill, the Stop Woke Act, which is an anti-CRT bill.
Let me ask you this, Brandon. If those numbers are, as you said, where majority of Floridians support the bill, how did the bill get passed with the votes that it got both in the Florida Senate and in the Florida House, of the state legislative branch, the two branches of government in the state of Florida?
Well, here's the answer. Power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. The Florida legislature has been run by Republicans for decades. The Republicans have had control of the governor's mansion for something like 25 years. And so when you get drunk on your own power, when you get high on your own supply, as Representative Randy Fine of Brevard County said in this last legislative session, we do it because we can. And so as you look at the political ambitions of Governor DeSantis and the trajectory of those who want positions in leadership or seats as chairs of committees, they're looking at the furthest right wing of their base that they need to curry favor for in order to win primary election cycles. DeSantis is not living in a vacuum as he thinks about his 2024 plans. There's also a self-obsessed political mercenary by the name of Donald Trump, who's a Florida resident. And if Donald Trump wants to run for president, that could set them up for a primary clash. So how does Governor DeSantis win something like that? Well, he trots out a resume of culture war issues that he has successfully fought in the legislature, including anti-CRT bills, anti-protest bills, anti-LGBTQ bills like this one. And that is what this entire conversation is about. It's about building a resume to run to the right of Donald Trump, to build this political platform to go and run for president in 2024. To Sharita's point, our job is to make them pay a political price for it. Thus far, they've not been forced to do that. They passed the transgender youth sports ban last year, and they need to pay a political price for that as well. So Equality Florida's role is not only to protect and defend LGBTQ Floridians in the court system, which will mean legal challenges to this bill, but it's also our job to protect and defend LGBTQ Floridians at the ballot box and to remind politicians like Governor Ron DeSantis, Representative Joe Harding, Senator Dennis Baxley, the sponsors of this bill, that if you come for the LGBTQ community, that we and our allies will simply remove you from office and elect politicians who believe that we are people and deserve the same dignity and respect as everybody else.
And I'm glad you said that, because as I sit here, I'm thinking, why is DeSantis still the governor of Florida? You said the state is split 50-50 Dems, 50 Republicans. So, I hope, and you just confirmed for me, that there is an effort afoot to remove these politicians who are using the LGBT community as pawns in their ambitious plan for higher office. But what about voting rights in the state of Florida, Sharita? They're under attack as well. So how difficult is it going to be to unseat someone like DeSantis and these Republican lawmakers who continuously play to the most extreme portion of the Republican base? Because if those numbers about opposition to the bill are right, that means there's some Republicans that oppose this bill as well as Democrats in the state. So how do you unseat some of these extremists?
Areva, you hit the nail on the head. We have a democracy crisis in this country, and we have to restore voting rights. We have to fix partisan gerrymandering, and we have to ensure that the will of the people is actually reflected in our elections, which in places like Florida right now is not the case. This is why we've seen, in addition to these attacks on LGBTQI plus folks, in addition to other attempts at censorship and bringing back the culture wars, a almost myopic focus on eroding the rights of voters and eroding the principles of our democracy. It's because, as Brandon mentioned, these are only popular with a very small percentage of their base. And so rather than changing their policies to reflect what their constituents and voters want, these officials have decided instead to silence and to suppress the voice of not just opposing voices, but even moderate voices that could be voting and steering these policy debates. And so, that's why at the Center for American Progress, we don't just work on LGBTQI plus rights, and our partners like Equality Florida don't just focus on one aspect of these issues, but we're all united in the push to restore our democracy and restore voting rights as well.
Yeah, Brandon, I'll ask you the messaging. My friend that prompted me to do this show heard the messaging and asked me what was wrong with not talking about gay rights in kindergarten. And she's a very progressive, very liberal person, but the messaging resonated with her, the messaging from the supporters of the bill. Do we have, and we, collective we, have a messaging problem? Because when she read my response, she was like, oh, I got it, no problem. So are we doing enough to get the message out that these bills are, being used as political pawns by Republicans? And the first thing I said to her is, you always got to check the source. So, and I said a lot of other things about your governor and state legislators, which I won't say, but the point being, are we doing enough to get the right message out? Because I feel like sometimes as Dems, we're losing that battle.
Well, I think I want to give us some credit. It is very challenging to message a multi-generational, multiracial democracy. It is very difficult to message sharing in a society that encourages people to think only of themselves and their own productivity, their own lives. We have a society that values very much individualism. And as a result, it can be difficult to talk about what it looks like to live in harmony together. But even if that task is difficult or challenging, it's one that we have to step up to. I actually think that when it comes to the Don't Say Gay bill, part of the reason that you've seen Governor Ron DeSantis come out swinging in the last couple of weeks, we're only 2 weeks removed from him claiming that he'd never read the bill at all, or that he didn't have a dog in the fight. The reason you've seen Governor Ron DeSantis come out swinging is because they lost their footing on the messaging, that they thought they could trot this bill out and say that it was a bill about parental rights and education, that everyone would eat it up, and that they would be able to move on with the partisan political points they were looking for. But people are not fooled. I think the American people know better than that. Floridians certainly know better than that. And when we began to name the very real harms that this bill would do to their neighbors, to their family members, to their own families, people pushed back on it, and they didn't buy it in the same way that the Republican Party was hoping they would. These right-wing think tanks that Sharita was talking about, whether it's the Heritage Foundation or Moms for Liberty, that are cooking up these bills and shopping them around so they can be copy and pasted, have told Republicans that if you run this legislation, you'll score this many political points. You'll be able to run up the margins in, in red counties and hopefully win back some independents in purple counties for your next election cycle. And when they see that that's not happening, when they see that we're able to really specifically name the harm that the bill does, then they come out swinging with classic anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, like they're trying to turn your children queer, or anyone who disagrees with me is a pedophile. So I hear what you're saying around the messaging. Yes, I think we have to do more. I think we have to begin to ask ourselves how we're creating a proactive message around what kind of multiracial, multi-generational democracy we want to see. We have to begin to tell the stories of people who might be different from someone else in our community. We have to lift up the voices of people who are constantly marginalized in society. But I also think we have to acknowledge the task that we're up to, that we're not speaking to, as Sharita said, this myopic base of people who are singularly focused on preserving the status quo, that we have a difficult task ahead of us of painting a picture of an America that belongs to everyone. But I do think that we're up to that task.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you acknowledge the enormity of the task, and that's not lost on me, I think, or lost on anyone. That yes, as Dems, we're not monolithic, and we all have, there's this big melting pot, and folks have their different interests and things that drive them, unlike this base of Republicans who are singularly, as you said, focused on maintaining the status quo. So we do have a bigger challenge, but I'm encouraged listening to you, because with folks like you carrying the message forward, I think we definitely will continue to be successful. Just last question for you, Sharita. What do the advocates do now? Cathryn said they continue to fight. Doesn't matter if the bill gets signed by DeSantis, the fight will continue. Do you think that any of this work by the advocates might be swaying DeSantis away, or he's got to follow the playbook because the goal for him is 2024?
We don't have a choice but to fight. I mean, this is our community's survival. Every day I think of folks like the friends that Brandon lost, the kids in our community. The Trevor Project puts out absolutely heartbreaking data about the effect that these kinds of debates about whether or not you're part of the American fabric and whether or not you are part of your school or your society just because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, that has an actual concrete harm on our kids. New data from the Trevor Project found that 66% of LGBTQ youth, including 85% of transgender and non-binary youth, reported that recent debates on their rights in states was negatively impacting their mental health. We're seeing really high rates of suicidality on harms here. And so, for us, it's the survival of our young people. It's the survival of our friends. It's our own. We don't have a choice but to fight. And I'm really heartened that we're not in this fight alone. We've got amazing allies and advocates. And, we might win or we might lose a battle, but even in my lifetime, I have seen unimaginable progress on LGBTQ rights and equality. And we have public opinion on our side. We have, an amazing community and allies. And no matter what happens today or this week in Florida, I have nothing but hope for some really amazing changes with advocates like Brandon and his colleagues leading the fight.
Yeah. And Brandon, last question for you. Disney has been the focal point, and Cathryn said that's because they kind of stepped in it with a comment from their president. But are there other businesses that Floridians and want to see step up to the plate? We're seeing all these businesses in Russia, because of their invasion of Ukraine, pull out of Russia and exert their power, their monetary power and prowess. Are there other companies you want to see in Florida do the same thing, like show their support in a more substantial way than just issuing a press release?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to recognize that there are companies who've stepped up to the plate. There are over 150 corporations and small businesses that have signed on to a letter with the Human Rights Campaign and Freedom for All Americans in opposition to bills like the Don't Say Gay bill around the country. We had another 24 chambers of Congress here in Florida and companies sign on to a letter opposing the Stop Woke Act, which would censor conversations about, racial injustice and American history in classrooms and in diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. So there are companies stepping up into the fold, but the short answer is yes. This only works as a society if we do it in concert with one another. If we can all get on the same page that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And that means getting the voices of our business community involved. It means getting local and statewide elected officials involved. It means getting nonprofit organizations built into a coalition together, people like Cathryn and Sharita and myself all working together toward one aim. And it also means elevating the voices of the most marginalized. I think what was most powerful for me about the Disney conversation over the last couple of weeks is that it was sparked by employees at Disney. There were letters written by LGBTQ employees to their CEO that said, you're not doing enough for us. That if you want us to continue to work here, if you want Disney to be seen as a progressive, pro-LGBTQ brand, then you have to do more to protect us where we live, not just where we work. And it was that internal pressure that built external pressure that caused Bob Chapek to come back to the table and say, you know what, I think I made a mistake here. We can do more. So yes, we need every coalition partner. I'm emboldened to see the courageous young people like Gen Z for Change, who led thousands of students from Florida to walk out of their classrooms to oppose this bill. I'm emboldened by advocates who've raised their voices, by the people who've pitched in $5 or $10, or maybe even more in this fight this time around. And of course, I am emboldened and urging our business community to be a part of that coalition moving forward. I think if we can all get on that same page, if we can all be on the same page about the vision of Florida and the country that we want, that change is certainly possible.
And just finally, Brandon, what are your thoughts about DeSantis? You think he signs it and moves on with his ambition for higher office, or does all of this public pressure you just described from the students and the business community and the chambers of commerce, does all of this give him, heartburn and maybe a change of heart?
Well, listen, I don't want to be naive in assuming that any of the things that we've shared with Governor DeSantis are enough to change his mind. I knew when I stood face to face with him at Pulse nightclub in 2019 who he was as a person, as a politician. He stood on those grounds, the most hallowed grounds I know, and told us that he would stand with the LGBTQ community. I told him that showing up to show his respects, to lay flowers, to meet with us was a good first step, but that it wasn't nearly enough, that LGBTQ Floridians needed more from their governor, that he was going to have to show up. He nodded his head and seemed to agree with me. And it didn't take but a few months for him to realize that he might be better served in the short term, turning us into a punching bag instead. So I'm not naive to think that the work that we've done is enough to change his mind. But as Sharita said, and as Cathryn said before her, we don't have a choice but to fight. We show up every day to fight for LGBTQ young people because they're worth fighting for. We show up to help elevate and tell their stories because their stories are worth telling. And ultimately, we show up to give the governor and lawmakers every opportunity to do the right thing, to stand on the right side of history, because they will be accountable for what happens next. If Governor Ron DeSantis—
Brandon, I'm curious about this. You said he showed up at Pulse and said he's going to stand with the community. I'm sure you or someone in your coalition reminds him of that commitment on a regular basis. What does he say now? Has he said, this is my way of standing with you? Has he acknowledged, yes, I've turned my back on you? How does he respond to that? I mean, that's a pretty bold commitment that's memorialized, I'm sure, on video or somewhere. So it's not like he said it in secret. That's a public commitment to your community.
It was. And yes, we do everything we can to remind him that he was there that day and made a commitment to standing with the community. I'll say this, since that day, although he and his team agreed to keep the lines of communication open, I've not received a call from the governor. I would welcome one. I'd love to talk to him about the Don't Say Gay bill and other pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation. But ultimately, I think it speaks to who he is as a politician. He is singularly focused on his resume, on where he is headed. I think he is constantly calculating. Remember that he was sort of an obscure congressman from Jacksonville, Florida, until he launched the America First caucus and begged Donald Trump for an endorsement, and then ended up on Fox News every night, and now he's our governor. So I think he's someone who knows very well where he wants to be career-wise and is willing to do anything in the moment to help get him that next level up on the ladder. Unfortunately, the target of his political ambitions and his ire are LGBTQ young people, especially trans kids. And once again, it's our job to give him an opportunity to stand on the right side of history, to make good on that promise that he made while standing on the hallowed grounds of Pulse. And if he decides not to do that, then we get to hold him politically accountable for that in November.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad. I just, it just baffles me to see politicians do that, but I'm not naive either. I see it happen every day. But there's a response to it. And that response is called organizing. It's called getting your voters out, and it's called throwing people out of office. And we've seen it done with opponents even tougher than him, which is why Donald Trump is talking about what happened to him outside of the White House. So we were able to get him out of office. So I'm encouraged that DeSantis, too, may have a very short-lived career as governor of the state of Florida if he continues to engage in this conduct. Thank you both for your commitment. Thank you for your advocacy. And thank you for spending some time with me, helping us understand this very complex issue.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of my guests this morning, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. This is such a fascinating topic. As I said, I was reading the headlines daily about what was happening in Florida, and then got this text from a good friend of mine and got really engaged, started reading more about it because I wanted to give her a thoughtful response. And there are thoughtful people who consider themselves liberal and progressive and who support the LGBT community who were and are confused by what's happening in the state of Florida. So I wanted to bring forth bright and articulate advocates so that people wouldn't be confused and that they would know that this is not about protecting parental rights or giving parents the rights to control what happens in classrooms. This is really about targeting LGBT kids and the entire community. And it's really shameful. And the governor and the state legislators who are responsible for it should be called out. And every opportunity we get, we should call them out. The reality is there are 23 million adults in the country, in the United States, who identify as LGBT. 1 in 5, Generation Z, and those are the people who are 10 years old to 25-year-olds. So those are our young people. 1 in 5 of that generation identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community. So these are our young people, and they are expressing themselves. And we have to do everything we can. Those of us who are from a different generation owe it to these young people to support them and to ensure that the laws enacted in states and by the federal government protect them, not discriminate against them, not retaliate against them. We've come too far in this country with respect to LGBTQ rights. Lots of progress has been made even in the last 10, 20 years, but so much more needs to be done. And laws like this law in the state of Florida and the state of Texas and those states around the country, those 200 plus bills that we know have been introduced, they send the country backwards in a most hateful and shameful way. We've come forward with rights of African Americans, rights of Latinx people, rights of Asian American people, rights of LGBT community. And we have to continue to move forward rather than go backwards, because we know how ugly that past is, and we know how much violence members of the LGBT community have suffered and will continue to suffer if we allow laws like the one passed in the state of Florida to go into effect. So I stand in solidarity with Floridians. I stand in solidarity with the LGBT community, and will do everything in my power to raise awareness to make sure the messaging gets out about this bill and others like it, so that people will know you are not supporting LGBT kids or our kids in kindergarten when you support this law. You are discriminating against them, and you are supporting the animus of ignorant, backwards thinking lawmakers. And this is what brings me to my words to live by. These words are from the iconic actor Morgan Freeman. He says, and this is what Morgan says, "I hate the word homophobia. It's not a phobia. You're not scared. You're an asshole." Morgan's words, not mine. Y'all be safe out there. And remember, we're all in this together.